Hello, in this video I'm looking at why you would choose Chromebook for education, what it can do for you in an education setting, and how to choose the correct one. So for starters, two big reasons from the past on why Chromebooks became popular were cost and battery life. So Chromebooks generally inexpensive. An education one will cost you from around 200 to 300 euro for a basic model, and the battery life is generally 8 to 10 hours. Now, these two have been mitigated slightly. Microsoft have dropped the cost of licensing for Windows on lower end machines, so the price has come down. They've essentially released a competing model, a Cloudbook, which is essentially similar to a Chromebook. They've got a version of Windows that's more like Chrome called Windows S, where you're only allowed to install apps from the Windows Store. So those two things are not as strong an advantage as they used to be. But one thing that is an advantage to you if you're a G Suite school is the workflow. From a Chromebook, when you log in straight away, you're into your files, you're into your Google Classroom, and it's a very fast, quick workflow, aided by the use of most of the Chromebooks. They will all have SSDs, which are really fast hard drives, and that leads to a really fast workflow. Now, one area Chrome really has an advantage in terms of deployment and management. So I've been using Windows since 3.1, and I've been using Windows Server and Active Directory for many years. And switching to G Suite, it's easy to see why schools could go down this route. It's much easier to manage versus Active Directory. And in terms of imaging of systems, power washing, as Google call it, power washing a Chromebook and just logging in, you're back going. With Windows machines, you're either running a deployment server or you're maintaining images, and then you're dealing with keys and a fairly lengthy reinstall process quite often. And there's a lot that can go wrong with the Windows operating system because it is more fully featured. So deployment and management is one of the massive strengths that Chromebooks have in education, and particularly in Ireland, where we don't tend to have permanent IT support staff in schools, or it's contracted out. It really enables a post holder or enthusiastic teacher with a bit of training to be able to maintain a lot of the back end infrastructure. Whereas with Windows, unless you're very experienced or certified in Active Directory, it can be a bit trickier. Now, this is mitigated again with kind of cloud-based, Azure-based Active Directory offerings from Windows, but I still think from a G Suite point of view that the Chromebooks are hard to beat. So in short, Microsoft is moving in that direction, and they have moved in that direction. They have a very good product as well, but I would still say that you can't beat the deployment and management of the Chromebooks at present. Now, so secondly, what can Chromebooks do? Well, would you be right in saying that Chromebooks can only run the Chrome browser? You would not. Okay, in the past that was true, and using G Suite and all the online apps is certainly one of the main focuses of the Chromebooks. But as I will cover in my second video, you can now install Linux apps, and you have access to a broad array of open source software on that platform. And you can also install Android apps from the Google Play Store. So you now have three sources to draw on for your apps, and that really opens up the possibilities of the device. And it really makes Chromebooks a very interesting proposition going forward. A lot of this had been experimental in the past, but now the Linux features are officially supported by Google, as is the Play Store in the education environment. So there's some very interesting developments, and I'm going to do a separate video on how to set up Linux and how to set up Android apps on Chromebooks. And they've really filled in a few gaps for us. For instance, there's some key software. Like a lot of the work you can do on the cloud online, but there are very good offline programs like Audacity for creating podcasts or video editing. There are online platforms, but with these Android and Linux apps, you could use Keyden Live from the Linux side, or it's commercial products like Power Director you can use on the Android side. If you can use WeVideo online, but maybe if you're broadband or bandwidth, and that's the other thing, like having these extra apps really brings the Chromebook alive as an offline device, because the standard Chrome and Chrome web apps, a lot of those do depend on your connectivity. So some gaps there, like MuseScore for music, and we have the Audacity, and then in the programming side of it, you can install Tony and Python programming. So it enables it to be a kind of a jack of all trades. Now, there are still some pieces of software that won't work on the Chromebook. So your Microsoft Office, although you can use the online version of that, and things like the Adobe Photoshop and obviously SolidWorks, things like that, they tend to be Windows only. So So it's something to look at, it's something to consider. That there's a trade-off there, features for the speed of the workflow and the ease of maintenance that you're getting there as well. Now, in terms of buying advice, so Chromebooks tend to start around €200, and for that you're getting a basic model with 2 gigabytes of RAM and 16 gigabytes of storage. I would recommend for schools go up a bit, 250 including the VAT, 300 including the VAT. You should be getting something with 4 gigabytes of RAM, 32 gigs of storage. Storage to 32 gigs is particularly important if you're going to be running Linux apps, and I'll explain that in my second video. Also, the processor is worth looking at. So I'm not going to go into detail on processors here. What your best bet there is, when you're looking at a model, go look at benchmarks and see how they compare to similar models. But I will tell you this on the Linux, on the processors, on the lower end school-based Chromebook device, they'll basically be split into two families. One is your Intel processors, they're commonly known as i86 processors, and the other is ARM processors. Now, if they're like for like and similar performance, there's a general rule is that the Linux apps, if you're into those, they'll perform a bit better on the i86, the Intel Celeron processors, because Linux is a desktop operating system geared towards the i86 stuff, and the Android apps will actually could possibly perform a bit better on the ARM processors, because the Android apps are generally compiled, designed for ARM processors, because in the phones the ARM processors are king. You don't get the i86s, so something like the Snapdragon processor, one of the most common processors in phones, that's ARM based. So it's a bit of a technicality, but generally speaking, check out the benchmarks. And if you're wanting to run desktop apps, it can be recommended that you look at more the Intel i86 side. And if you're looking at running more Android apps like touchscreen Chromebook or something like that, then the ARM could be worth looking at as well. So you can obviously go up the chain, and there are Chromebooks at around €1,000, which are going to have fantastic specifications. But I'm looking more at the education geared ones, and I'm going to give you an overview of the hardware you would get for around the 300 mark. So this Chromebook is under €300, including the VAT, and it's an Acer model. And what you'll find now, a lot of the models, and it varies from model to model, they'll have some level of ruggedization. So this has got rubber sides, so if it impacts off a wall or something, or they're all drop tested, etc. What tends to make them a lot more robust is the SSD, the solid state hard drives. They don't have that moving spindle like the older laptops had, which could be an issue when you're dropping it and stuff. And what you'll find with the new generation of Chromebooks as well, something very interesting, is that in terms of ports, they tend to have dropped things like HDMI as a display port, and they're relying instead on this USB-C port. So this is part of the kind of USB-C, one port to rule them all model, whereas you'll actually charge your device through the USB-C, and you'll display to a monitor through the USB-C. And actually newer monitors that are coming with USB-C inputs will also charge the laptop while displaying from the laptop. So the idea is, instead of having to plug in a charger and plug in a cable into your monitor, you'll just plug in the one cable from your monitor, and that will both charge the laptop and bring your display for docking. So it's a very neat solution there. Now, however, if you're in a school and you want to get this onto a screen, you'll need a HDMI adapter. But generally with Chromebooks and you're using Google Classroom, you don't need to be plugging them in and out of screens, or you can use Chromecast and other solutions around there. But something just to look at if you're wondering why it doesn't have a HDMI port. The video output is on the USB-C now. It's also got your traditional USB-A port, so handy for all your legacy devices that you've got. And it's got a micro SD card for expanding your storage memory. So you can buy cards. You're still better off going for the 32 gig of internal storage, because when you're installing your programs, that's going to go onto your internal storage, whereas if you're storing files, that's going to go on here. Now, generally speaking, you're using Google Drive, so you're not storing a lot of files on the machine unless you're maybe doing a bit of video editing or something like that. The last port you have here then is the combo jack. That's the microphone and earphone port. So if you've got a hands-free set from your phone, etc., that'll take the mic and it'll take the headphone as well. The other side has just one port, and that is your Kensington lock port. So that's just a little cable locks you can get to secure it to the desk. These new machines, they tend to be quite easy to fix as well. You just take off the keyboard and then take out the motherboard, and the bits are there. Not that you probably won't be fixing them, but if you were, they tend to be kind of easy and quick to repair. And then in terms of webcams, you can look at models. It's great, of course, if you can get the models into your hands. So If you go to something like Bet, around the Google stand there, they tend to have all the Chromebooks. But there is a similarity, if you're looking at the components inside them, tend to be quite similar across the range. And another thing that's worth noting is Google guarantee updates and support for a certain lifespan of the machine. With this one, it's till 2026. So if you're looking at a school environment, you're guaranteed updates and support. Now, it'll still work afterwards, but you mightn't be getting the latest features of the operating system. So this will work up till a student graduates. Another thing to consider if you're in a school is to get a management license. So there's an extra charge for that at the moment. So that gives you features like being able to lock down the machines to domain users, to be able to lock them remotely and things like that. Google do recommend, if you're using Chromebooks in a school environment, that they are managed, because it gives you a lot more granular control over who can use them and what they can do on them. So I hope that's given you a bit of an insight into Chromebooks in education. And if you're interested in running Linux and Android apps on your Chromebooks, check out my second video. And any questions, reach out to me on Twitter.